Never in modern history has a war begun with so smashing a victory. In 1 hour and 50 minutes, the Japanese have sunk or shattered 8 battleships. Oklahoma, West Virginia, Arizona, Nevada, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers, and 4 smaller ships are sunk or battered.
So we unloaded this ammunition, and the driver took off with the truck, and here we are with a pile of what then was highly classified stuff. So we took turns and passed my weapon around. Each of us stood about 2 hours out in the rain.
And now, a station having for its primary function the creation of the Naval Ordnance Test Station at China Lake was a matter of wartime necessity. Its continued existence following the drastic post-war drawdown was a matter of unusual foresight. Its phenomenal growth and unprecedented success in the decades that followed were matters of national importance. Described early on in the press as the Navy's secret city, it was hidden behind the address Knott's Inyakern for about a decade. And even if some of its products were well known, the station itself remained largely hidden from the public, and even from the vast majority of its customers in the fleet. An old Army airstrip out in the middle of nowhere provided the cornerstone. And the story opened in early November 1943 with a college professor and his assistant huddled under a tin roof guarding a pile of prototype rockets with a .38 revolver. From that unlikely initiation arose the Navy's premier weapons research, development, test, and evaluation center, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the war. The Second World War was, more than any before it, a war of technology. Scores of new devices, those secret weapons beloved by the writers of newspaper headlines, were being pursued by a novel mix of military, academic, and industrial experts under the umbrella of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. The ground-up creation of a full-spectrum center for the application of technology to immediate military needs was a massive and unprecedented endeavor. And the creation of China Lake, labs and ranges and air center and community, was an endeavor comparable, really, only with its even more secret cousin, Los Alamos, an activity founded by some of the same people who had helped establish China Lake. Knott's was officially established on 8 November 1943 as a station having for its primary function the research, development, and testing of weapons, and having additional function of furnishing primary training in the use of such weapons. The name chosen in the East, the Naval Ordnance Test Station, carefully masked the true extent of the China Lake mission, and no open mention was made for many years of a significant and very secret sub-element of the Manhattan Project that was soon added to the station's mission. A complex undertaking, to say the least. China Lake was to develop and test weapons for the fleet and for the Marines. Big rockets for the smashing of the impossible concrete walls of Japanese pillboxes, and massed rockets for the breaching of the bristling beach obstacles on both fronts. Rockets that fired backwards for attacking submarines, and rockets that fired forward for attacking planes, trains, trucks, and tanks. The rockets needed fire control and launchers. Warheads and motors, too, which made explosives and propellants, and the means and methods for their manufacture in the massive quantities required to make an impact on a conflict of such unprecedented scale. And the pilots needed training, too, in the use of these new weapons, as did the ordies and the crews. The test range needed an airfield, and that needed aircraft support facilities, and fuel farms, and supply yards, and barracks, and mess halls, and ship services. The place wasn't designed just for testing. It was designed for everything. Everything needed to conceive and design and develop and document and test and evaluate and ship out new things to the operators. And novelty meant laboratories, which needed machine shops and supply drops, calipers and balances and slide rules and magazines of every sort. And people to operate all that, and people to feed them, and do their laundry and their typing and their pay stubs, and operate telephones too, and someday television. Someone to pump gas and fix the inevitable broken windows, to water the trees and lawns and baseball diamonds that help make the blazing Mojave summers at least tolerable so far from civilization. All those things, all those people required to make a dirt-scrabble test range into a full-spectrum laboratory and an isolated outpost into a complete, cohesive community. It would be a rather strange place, especially as military outposts go. Civilian scientists housed next door to Navy pilots. Their technicians and tin benders right down the street. They'd all shop at the commissary, and they'd belong to the same social clubs and play on the same teams. Their kids would go to the same schools, all of them on board. And on Saturday night, they'd dress for dinner and dance to the band at the Officers Club, or the Chiefs Club, or the AC Doocy, or the Old Jolly Roger, wherever their military or civil service rank placed them. They'd advance their projects with over-the-fence discussions over a cold beer, and they'd create what would become known as the China Lake way of doing business. Creativity, initiative, competition, and not a little risk, in a full-spectrum laboratory dedicated to serving the fleet. And one day, every China Laker, from those who did a short tour with a tenant unit to those who spent 5+ decades dedicated to the lab, would be able to look back and say, we've been into just about everything at one time or another, from submarines to satellites, dumb bombs to smart bombs, small arms to sidearms. But that's another story.
The peculiar advantage of aircraft rockets is that they are relatively large self-propelled missiles, exerting no recoil forces on their launchers. They have a greater penetration than small cannon or general-purpose bombs, and greater accuracy than bombs.
I was very well impressed with NOTS because it carried the wartime spirit forward. See, during World War II, we were gung-ho to accomplish. And the government gave us the freedom to accomplish, and we did accomplish.
And now, the Rocket Racket. Rockets were the primary reason that the China Lake Laboratory was brought into being in November of 1943. Those rockets were one aspect of the secret weapon war that included technological marvels such as radar, sonar, proximity fuses, rudimentary guided missiles, and, the most deadly secret of all, the atomic bomb. During the war, the station's military and academic leaders developed a relationship, a community literally, that focused on the fleet and was supported by the Bureau. China Lake also began to develop the programmatic breadth and depth that would mark it as unique among laboratories, to say nothing of military establishments. That operational technical team created an activity with the unique capability to respond, and respond fast to operational requirements. The superb cooperation between the lab and the fleet, between the engineer and operator, designer and machinist, planner and pilot, would allow the station to respond with more than rockets. By some lights, everything that has flowed from the China Lake labs and shops and ranges in the post-war decades descends from those first Caltech Navy rockets. There's truth to that. The descendants of the station's earliest endeavors branch out from the wartime rocket program into every sort of guided missile and every sort of free-fall bomb, into bomb directors and fire control, and into both the tech base and the T&E establishment to support them all. The station's emergence from the post-war institutional austerity with an expanding program, an expanding physical plant, and an expanding population of scientists and specialists was epitomized by the opening in 1948 of massive modern Michelson Laboratory, a state-of-the-art facility with fewer offices than research labs and specialized shops occupying its 10+ acres. With a full-scale laboratory available, physicists, chemists, engineers, draftsmen, and model makers, with shops and test chambers and vast ranges right next door. With airplanes, pilots, and ordies available on the spot, the station could and would follow wherever technology allowed and wherever the fleet demanded. And the station would lead the technological charge in many areas with basic and applied research, and with studies and analyses of threats and requirements and a world of possibilities. War in Korea in 1950 created the stage on which to show just what such a full-spectrum laboratory could do under the gun, as it were. When monstrous Soviet tanks entered the fray, China Lake responded with Project RAM. The China Lake team designed, developed, tested, documented, and built the pilot production rounds of the 6.5-inch tank-killing rocket that were delivered to the operators in Korea in just 28 days. China Lake had begun the post-war era with a startling array of new rockets already in the works for barrage and bombardment and breaching, for attacking tanks, trucks, and trains, and submarines too, and the directed evolution of those weapons was fast and furious throughout the 50s. One family of follow-ons would acquire folding fins, disposable pod launchers, and an amazing array of warheads. And the station was creating internal carriage schemes long before anyone ever heard of stealth. The sub-hunting branch that started with retro rockets and hedgehogs created the oddly configured Weapon A and evolved through RAT and ASROC and on into today's VLA. From every aspect of the Rocket Racket arose some other. Guided missiles, obviously, once the guidance was placed atop the rocket. Plus all the components thereof. Sensors and seekers, servos and steering fins, fuses and initiators. And the avionics, too, before the term was coined, for the missile and for the airplane, and for the missile to talk to the airplane, and vice versa. Advanced fire control came from the lab's pursuit of accuracy. Against bunkers and against bombers. The new generation of folding fin rockets was designed for air-to-air, since guided missiles were a generally unreliable lot, at least until Sidewinder came along. And Sidewinder itself was built upon the tried and true 5-inch rocket and its in-house developed and proven technologies. Accuracy was a prime motive of the laboratory. Even a near miss with an unguided rocket fired from a moving airplane against a moving target on the ground or in the air was no mean feat. Try throwing a rock out the window of your car doing 90 down a washboarded dirt road to hit the jackrabbit crossing that road at an increasingly oblique angle. Better do your math fast. They did it on slide rules, supplemented by a heavy metal battery of clattering electromechanical Marchands and Monroes and Friedens. And they developed advanced computing techniques as computing machines evolved. And they applied those new machines and their programs, analogs first, then the revolutionary digitals, and even strange hybrids, to every problem in the arsenal. From modified machine gun sights hastily adapted to the needs of rockets, came the progenitors of China Lake's aircraft fire control systems. These began as electromechanical integrators, gears, levers, the occasional vacuum tube, and became the complex, precise, multi-technological wonders from which directly descend today's weapon integration and software support activities for digital-driven airplanes that literally cannot fly without massive computing power. And, of course, Sidewinder is in that lineage too. The placing of the fire control system into the rocket spawned its first incarnation, the so-called heat-homing rocket, the moniker designed to hide the guided missile from a bureaucracy that had officially removed that area of endeavor from the station's mission. The station pioneered simulation techniques as well, in hardware and in software. At China Lake, real rockets rode rails, flying in simulated free space. Model rockets flew free through real space. And soon enough, virtual rockets flew through virtual space. Countermeasures and countermeasures too stemmed from these efforts. China Lake even countermeasured its own weapons in advance of their usurpation by highly adaptable enemies. The lab created specialized pyrotechnics and the methods for their delivery, and their formulation and production and use, whether to deceive an opponent's sensors, or to deceive Mother Nature and bust a hurricane, or break a drought. The needs of the fleet pressed the station to pursue R&D in related fields, the airframes and the fins and the control surfaces, the warheads and the motors, with the explosives and propellants to fill them, The fuses and igniters and initiators and safe arm devices for those too. And, branching off its early pilot plant initiatives, the methods for the scale-up of the energetics for all of that, and the machining and the casting and production and packaging as well. That expertise in energetics would lead the station into projects both massive and subtle, from strategic missile motors to aircraft ejection systems, and even swimmer weapons. During the deepening Cold War, China Lakers would expand upon their conventional weapons expertise to ensure that the Navy would also have modern weapons that didn't have nuclear warheads. Before the atom-mad 50s were over, the station would embark on a program to create an entirely new family of modern conventional weapons, the I series, deliverable from nearly any aircraft for terrain denial, direct attack, and deterrence. By the late 1950s, station facilities could support nearly anything the China Lake Wizards could come up with, even new rockets. China Lake's vast and varied ranges began with a quickly bulldozed firing line for the early Caltech rockets. Ranges soon followed to support some of the Navy's earliest guided missiles, which were problematic to test on the already cramped East Coast ranges. But the new station had room. The simple ranges of World War II evolved fast, and T&E facilities for the firing of rockets and torpedoes and both air and surface-launched missiles blossomed. Air and ground and undersea ranges. Live fire arenas. Target complexes. Huge towers for fuse tests. An array of specialized test and research tracks. And strange things ran down those tracks to fire crosswise into the wind. Catch atomic artillery shells in mid-flight. Stage an emergency ejection at high speed. And figure out just what happens to missile radomes in a rainstorm at Mach+. And for decades, bombs and missiles and ejection seats and things even more arcane rode the rails pushed by leftover HVARs and tiny Tims. Environmental and safety and non-destructive evaluation facilities were designed, building on the lessons of the rocket programs. Foundations were laid, too, to support new technologies that would soon be brought to the fore by the new realities of a new sort of war. The labs and ranges were already being envisioned to create the things that hovered on the fringes of the imagination at the time. VTOL airplanes and night vision devices, software-driven weapon systems, and ramjet-powered, multi-mode-guided, satellite-linked automatons. The station's early involvement with the application of the atom came back around too during the atomic-obsessed Cold War decades as China Lake applied nuclear spearheads to some of its rockets. The station did not handle the warheads, but in great secrecy, the laboratory bore to be launched from aircraft, and Big Stoop from the ground, and Marlin from beneath the surface of the sea. And ultimately, China Lake's vast rocket expertise was called in to help create what would become Polaris. The station's broad abilities and experience base allowed it to conduct the targeting studies and the applications of emerging and projected technologies to an ongoing development program, ultimately shaping the nation's submarine-launched strategic deterrent system. The legacy of those first rockets, those seemingly simple secret weapons of another era, was a technical program so broad, so diverse, and so sweeping as to take the station in less than 2 decades since its founding, from the very depths of the ocean to the fringes of outer space. A technical program that would not only help provide the deterrent weapons for the Cold War, but that would also provide the new generation of weapons, the dumb, the smart, and the sneaky, for the coming decades. But that's another story.
I'm Chet Huntley. To most of us, this is the United States Navy. the aircraft carrier, the cruiser, and destroyer, the modern deep water Navy, extending American strength across the oceans of the world. July 1964. Off the coast of Vietnam, units of the United States 7th Fleet patrol the waters of the South China Sea. To help the people of South Vietnam defend themselves against the threat of an armed communist takeover, the United States and other countries have begun a flow of economic, technical, and financial aid, a joint civilian-military effort to build a stronger nation.
I will argue that China Lake really became of age in, say, 1960 or so. We had enough experience in various things that we weren't afraid to tackle anything.
And now, coming of age. By the mid-1960s, as the China Lake activity neared its quarter-century mark, it had changed a great deal from its hurried wartime inception and its immediate post-war uncertainty. There were modern laboratories and decent housing, and a record of achievement to be envied. But China Lake was still pretty much a rough-and-ready outpost with something of a Wild West flavor, even as the counterculture that would define the 60s for the television-watching public began to take hold outside. Most of the fondly monikered Caltech Mafia that had founded the place had moved on, although many did remain involved with the station through advisory boards and consulting. But the pattern that they'd set with their visionary military counterparts, the ideal that they'd created, remained. The China Lake team also had, by then, a number of highly placed alumni. Skippers Stroop and Ashworth, and experimental officers Chick Hayward and the noted Three Toms, Moorer, Connolly, and Walker, all wore at least 3 stars, and that didn't hurt a bit. The China Lake community had grown apace, and the people who came in the station's earliest days with the promise of being gone in a year had stayed on in droves. Few moved off the base and into town, outside the comfort of the gate, away from the cheap rents and the unique camaraderie that this odd military-civilian company town offered. It may still have had temporary housing left over from World War II and bouts of the infamous termination winds, but it was a community, in every best sense of the word, and it was essential to the success of the station. The vast ranges of the fledgling station had been about doubled over the years, and rough facilities modernized, expanded, and turned to new uses. China Lake laboratories and shops could turn out nearly anything in short order, and the ranges hastily established to support firing rockets and early guided missiles had been redoubled, refined, and remarkably instrumented to support RDT&E in nearly every conceivable factory-to-target environment. Plans were already being made and foundations laid for the station to support and exploit the up-and-coming solid-state and optical and simulation and software technologies as well. During the 1950s and early 60s, with a wide-open technology base and a supportive Navy hierarchy that shared a national attitude enamored of new frontiers, the station had almost shocking latitude to pursue projects and possibilities in almost any direction. And the station had not only the cradle-to-crate facilities and the staff of motivated experts to do so, it had an environment, an ideology, that fostered creativity, initiative, competition, and well-reasoned risk. The depth and breadth of the China Lake program was astonishing. Scientific research, along with operations research, requirements projection, and even studies in the nature of deterrence, formed the foundation of a full-spectrum RDT&E effort that included the improvement of brute-force dumb bombs and the elegant application of emerging technologies to integrated fire control systems, secret satellites, and multi-mode missile guidance systems. Knott's was the only Navy ordnance development activity to have a complete dedicated research department, and during the post-war decades, as technology was becoming an integral part of American culture, China Lake was already working with the stuff of magic. Transistors and lasers, computers that could fit in an airplane, and then even into a missile, devices that could see in the infrared and look through clouds and smoke, and ordnance that could literally change the weather. China Lake research projects pioneered mathematics and physics and chemistry to allow novel missile guidance schemes and to further the quest for orbit. Advanced materials for sensors and semiconductors, for mirrors and radomes and airframes. Cutting-edge applications of rapidly evolving computers and software for guidance and targeting and navigation, and for data collection and reduction, not to mention seminal efforts in simulation. The station created new generations of safer and more reliable, and at the same time more energetic, propellants and explosives, and mated them with motors that combined solid and liquid propellants, and added ramjets, too, for multiple Mach performance. China Lake would stretch the boundaries of technology with exotic thrust vector control and hybrid schemes that would allow a tactical missile to turn at impossible angles or launch straight up, and even allow ejection seats to launch straight down. Research projects had gone even further afield by the early 60s. Air-launched satellites, and satellite tracking stations too, and satellite killers. Research submarines, recovery submarines, fighter submarines, and it was no coincidence that the dolphin the Navy was talking to was named Naughty. Research was the foundation, but development was the meat of the program. Sidewinder and Shrike made the papers, as it were, and they were copied by friend and foe alike. But many of the station's contributions remained all but unknown outside its gates. China Lake's projects, however, made a profound impact on the operational Navy, and in the case of systems like Polaris, on the increasingly Cold War-gripped world as a whole. There is literally no complete list of the station's products and projects as it approached the beginning of its third decade. Pages and pages of marks and mods were in the fleet or in the works. AIMs and AGMs, a raft of AFCSs and AN/somethings. Code names, nicknames, acronyms, enough to befuddle the most diligent lexicographer, represented devices and technologies that flowed from the China Lake laboratories and shops and ranges. Tiara, Chloe, and Adam Fleer. PBX, Focus, Dividing Wall, and Bohr. Viperscan, Tarasca, Tevrock, and T-Bird. Cyclops, Stormfury, and Grommet. And the ultimately secret Project Popeye. And yes, there were some very secret things going on in the secret city. Things that have yet to see the light of day. After Tiny Tim and Holy Moses, China Lake began fielding the folding fin aircraft rockets, Zuni and Mighty Mouse by the literal millions. But there was a legion of nameless rockets with only numbers and initialisms to identify them through the development process. Bombrock, HPAG, HPAW, SSAR, GPSR, ad almost infinitum. And China Lake had its eyes, the famously accurate walleye, and Hawkeye come Rockeye, and Snake Eye, and Sad Eye, Den Eye, Bright Eye, Glad Eye, and even Evil Eye. Stranger Things under 8-Ball and Dirty, and Cobra and Cupid. There were Elsie and Betty, too, cute names for decidedly serious things demanded by a fleet ever near the edge of all-out war. There were devices to let the operators, in the air or on the surface, see their targets in the dark, or light them up with subtle chemistry, or million-candle power flares. Fax, better known as FAY, went into the field, along with dozens of small, specialized things designed to support a military gearing up for so-called limited warfare. Swimmer, Swab, and SDV joined the station's idiom. Torpedoes, too, Marks 32 and numerous 40s, with even more mods, let alone Subrock and Subic and Subad and TTBM, even something called Swish. And the list includes ROCOS, RAM, RAP, RARE, and RAPEC, acronyms for projects ranging from exo-atmospheric research to one of the most successful of aircraft ejection seats. The Knot Zoo maintained an odd collection of animals as well, from bumblebees to thunderbirds, with condors and pack rats and shrikes and snipes and sparrows in between, not to mention lizards for the library, or the redbirds, or Sidewinder's big brother, Diamondback. China Lake Fire Control and Bomb Directing Systems began to set the standards for what would become a whole new area of endeavor in the coming years. And scores of fuses, TDDs, SNAs, AFs, flowed from the sister lab at Corona to complement the station's efforts. And all the while, following the pattern laid down by the founders, the station was wherever possible acting in concert with the fleet, with the operators in the lab, at the airfield, and in the visiting squadrons. And the station sent its people out to the operators, to the ships and to the combat zones, delivering the tools of the warfighter's trade, training the users, documenting the lab's successes and its failings, and bringing back the operational input so essential to the China Lake way of doing business. That closeness to the operators, an affinity far greater for the fleet than for the sponsors in headquarters, would be a key to China Lake's phenomenal productivity and to its very identity, as the seething conflict in Southeast Asia would come to define the decade for the laboratory. But that's another story.
march of time. Since civilization's beginning, the great monuments of the ages have been built on the knowledge of the men of science.
One of the most difficult tasks that I had as associate director was the responsibility for dividing up the discretionary funding, essentially deciding which projects to support and which not. Trying to tell Bill McLean that that idea wasn't worth funding. It wasn't a very pleasant task. He always had very good reasons for supporting the projects that he wanted to.
And now, Exploration and Discretion. Research. The search for knowledge, both abstract and applicable. Systematic investigation. The R in RDT&E. Although sometimes overlooked in the blaze of press that often greets a new weapon system as it hits the battlefield, the payoffs of the station's 6+ decade investment in technology investigation and application have been profound. The products of the station's research and technology efforts are as diverse as the original forward-looking infrared, or FLIR system, and the strange array of catalyst generators for weather modification. State-of-the-art technology for the creation and characterization of high-energy laser components and ultra-precision surfaces. New energetic materials with broad military and civilian application. And chemiluminescent compounds in visible and invisible spectra. China Lakers pioneered novel, reliable syntheses of everything from high-sensitivity semiconductors to high-temperature superconductors. From new conductive polymers to advanced antenna designs. Highly specialized energetic materials and highly efficient propulsion systems. Station advances in mathematics and computational sciences range from numerical theory to advanced image processing and automatic target recognition, and even to early library databases. Research, basic and applied, formed the foundation of the station's full-spectrum capability to support the fleet. It might seem obvious, as the R in RDT&E, but NOTS was the only Navy ordnance development activity to have a complete, dedicated research department. Beginning as the science department and led by Caltech veterans, the seeds of new technologies were nurtured and exploited in the physics, mathematics, and chemistry divisions. Applied sciences included groups for aerophysics, metallurgy, and optics. And the famous ballistics division gathered in some of the station's brightest and most colorful characters. It also produced a generation of the station's top leadership. Over the decades, emerging technologies drove the creation of Earth and Planetary Sciences and Aerothermal Chemistry and Computational Sciences divisions. Not that all research was confined to the research department. Specialists in numerous disciplines from across the station investigated and applied new and emerging technologies, like semiconductors, and polymers, and electron microscopy, and vapor phase deposition, and software. The station's academic ancestry and its concept to crate RDT&E philosophy, combined with a variety of educational advancement programs, university cooperative projects, and excellent support facilities, to create an atmosphere that fostered creativity and initiative. More importantly, the pursuit of basic knowledge was supported by China Lake's leadership and the bureaus, who saw the value of the exploration and exploitation of new and emerging technologies. And station leaders took the rather radical step early on of taxing the development programs a small percentage to support discretionary in-house efforts, exploratory and foundational research projects that would not be funded through the usual channels. These E&Fs, and later B&Ps, would help create and demonstrate technologies for some of the lake's most successful systems. And China Lake has consistently applied the state-of-its-art to more than its own programs. The station has been instrumental in the promotion of technology transfer to the public and private sectors, as well as in the formation and support of the Federal Laboratory Consortium for Technology Transfer. China Lake Research has brought new technology to the station's and the nation's weapon systems, from the radome to the exhaust nozzle, with every subsystem, sensor, and software in between. Adhesives and batteries and diamond surfaces grown on command. Deposition methodologies and chemical precursors to advance the semiconductor sciences. New knowledge of exotic airframe structures and pressure vessels and the methods for explosive forming and welding. Things that reflect and direct the laser's awesome light, or absorb invisible wavelengths to pull bright images out of blackness. And more subtle things, such as the mathematics of randomness and the underlying physical properties of materials. Literally something of nearly everything, from submarines to satellites, and the sensors for both, and the materials, the techniques, the software to advance their capabilities up to and beyond the so-called state-of-the-art. At no other activity were there so many possibilities to discover a principle in the lab, evolve it into a basic technology, apply that to an area of potential benefit, and walk that application through the development process, right into an ongoing or even a brand new development program. And from there onto the drawing boards and into the shops, into the test chambers and onto the ranges, through Mantech and QA and logistics, and at last into the fleet, onto the ships, the planes, the combat vehicles, into the hands of those whose trade it is to protect the nation with the tools the laboratory provides. But that's another story.
Jenkins' fast work and flair for publicity put him out ahead of the pack very quickly. In a 1927 publicity coup, Jenkins unveiled the first long-distance television transmission in history.
It's pretty easy once you have TV on the market, which was delayed by World War II, that if you could put that in the air and figure out a way to use it, you could see what you were tracking.
And now, television on target. The promise of television reaching into the living rooms of average American families was put on hold by the Second World War, which also served as impetus to advance the state of TV technology in the manic pursuit of new entries in the secret weapon race. Television promised precision and distance, increasingly essential aspects of an increasingly airborne conflict. An autonomous weapon could keep the pilot clear of enemy defenses. An accurate autonomous weapon could pinpoint a power plant and spare the neighborhood around it. That early TV technology was applied to glide bombs, small drone aircraft, and worn-out bombers packed with explosives. Weary Willy B-17s and TDR assault drones saw little combat, but proved prophetic once the technology caught up. Following the war, China Lake continued investigating almost every potential guidance technology imaginable. Radio and radar, visible light, infrared, active and semi-active and passive, command-guided and fully autonomous. China Lake experimented with scores of schemes to put rockets and bombs and torpedoes on target, creating increasingly sophisticated evolutions of the rocket sights of the 1940s, and at the same time putting its fire control tech into the rockets. And in an era in which electro-optical technology, TV, was at the cutting edge, the station was already working toward the application of its promise of precision to new generations of weapon and aircraft systems. From centered experimental fire control and bomb directing hardware came the ideas for an automatic tracking television guidance system. Such a device had been demonstrated in 1953 at NOL Corona, but the technology of the day still didn't well support the dream. By the late 50s, though, a group at China Lake had begun demonstrating the technology and hardware for what would become the first successful autonomous electro-optical guided weapon, Walleye. Walleye demonstrated just how accurate the TV camera could be. And the weapon's combat op-eval successes became legendary. Larger, longer range, and data link versions followed quickly in the original Walleye's wake. And a powered version, Condor, was developed with industry for even longer range capability. In the opposite direction, China Lake designed a tiny TV missile, the Snipe, to give helicopters and light aircraft an unprecedented precision attack capability. The China Lake team also continued fusing TV technologies into fire control systems, such as ARBs for Skyhawks and Harriers, and early automated weapon targeting systems. The station ran the technology out to the ranges, too, with both in-house innovation and off-the-shelf application for data collection and drop scoring and event control. The station put TV into sophisticated remotes to support T&E and simulation as targets and as test platforms. And China Lake presented full-on fighters to its developmental missiles. China Lake's instrumentation efforts also resulted in the creation of the shuttered video technology that would become industry standard. Station efforts to advance Walleye and Condor and TV guidance in general resulted in smaller, even more precise electro-optical devices. Triple LTV that allowed missiles and sensors to function in extremely low light. Odd spectrum imagers combining technologies to provide clear vision in the dark. Seekers that could penetrate fog and haze and dust. And many of today's lumbering giants of the battlespace, weapons little evolved from the convertibombs that tried to displace Walleye in its early days, owe much of their seeker and data link technology to those China Lake efforts, as do the guidance systems for harpoons that turn them into slams, and the radical CCD imagers for air-to-air missiles. And a new generation of imaging technologies has spawned a new generation of weapons. Tiny, elegantly simple, and unerringly accurate, whether fired from ship or shoulder, helo or Hummer, rubber boat or toy plane. The little spike is a new kind of weapon for a new kind of war. The pursuit of precision continues, with the electro-optically eyed descendants of Weary Willie and Walleye wearing imaging seekers that are as far from the TV guidance packages of the 1960s as those were from the mechanical TV scanners of the 1920s. Compact, computer-packed automatons with seekers that can see through haze and darkness to pinpoint targets from the air and from the shoulder, with the ubiquitous offspring of the data link pods controlling nearly everything in the battlespace arena. But that's another story.
About 1/3 of the Navy's budget now goes for underwater ships and weapons. The Soviet Union now has about 500 submarines. Some experts say that eventually all fighting ships will be submarines. To improve techniques that enable man to live beneath the sea for months at a time, the Navy is studying a mammal that once walked on land and now lives in the sea. This is Noddy, a 3-year-old Pacific porpoise, 7 feet long, weighing 200 pounds.
She's the guinea pig for a research project that could lead to a revolution in underwater weapons, sounds detection, and anti-submarine warfare. Part of a much bigger program conducted by the Naval Ordnance Test Station at China Lake.
And now, from submarines to satellites. China Lake's involvement with submarine vehicles began for entirely practical purposes, to support its torpedo development and testing programs centered at the Knott's Pasadena Annex. During the early 1960s, an unlikely accretion of canisters, cables, and claws was designed to retrieve experimental items from the ocean floor. That first Knott submersible, called Curve, for cable-controlled underwater recovery vehicle, did quiet duty beneath the station's sea ranges, until it hit the world stage in 1966, when it was used to recover a nuclear weapon lost in deep water off the coast of Spain. Entirely aside from the torpedoes, ballistic missiles, and other submarine-launched weapons that the station was developing and supporting, along with its super-secret programs in submarine detection, communication, and air defense, China Lake maintained a broad-based program of research and experimentation in sciences and applications related to every facet of Navy operations and interest, including those beneath the surface of the sea. By the mid-1960s, Knott's was studying everything from how fish swim to the nature of the sea itself. Research covered bioluminescence, advanced propulsion, shark repellents, glass sphere pressure structures, and boundary layer control. The station was supporting sea lab operations and designing Rocksite, a research base on the sea floor. And Knott's scientists were talking to dolphins. Knott's borrowed the Suku, Jacques Cousteau's famous diving saucer, for some research work during 1964, and China Lake began designing and building its own submarine research vessels. Deep Jeep, DRV, Deep View, Hikino, and Moray. Conceived as a sort of undersea fighter plane, the Moray research prototype was built in MicLab machine shop and tested in the Snort Reservoir before going to sea for proof dives. Moray brought together much of the station's research and experimental work in submarine power, propulsion, and weapon systems. Most of China Lake's oceanographic studies and submarine development efforts went to other activities with the 1967 separation of the Pasadena Annex and the creation of the so-called Centers of Excellence with their more narrowly defined missions. But China Lake, as the Naval Weapons Center, did not withdraw entirely from the undersea realm. The center continued work on highly classified projects in special weapons, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and special warfare, weapons and submersibles for SEALs and covert operations. But that's another story.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. Here, an artist's conception of how the feat was accomplished. A three-stage rocket. Number one, the booster in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite. One of the great scientific feats of the age.
And I told Hack, I said, hey, I just saw Sputnik. And I said, you know what we ought to do, Hack? We ought to go shoot the damn thing down.
And now, from submarines to satellites. China Lake saw the development and support of satellites and space-related systems as logical extensions of the station's air weapons mission. It was the Navy, after all, that in the late 50s was pursuing an American orbit with the notoriously troubled Vanguard. When Sputnik entered the world's lexicon in such spectacular manner in October 1957, China Lakers decided to either shoot the thing down or catch up with it. Their attempt to catch up is fondly remembered as Natsnik. With only the vaguest permission and without access to large rocket boosters, China Lake took a radical approach. air launch. Officially under Project Pilot, the Knots crew hastily assembled, using only what was available in-house, not only a launch vehicle, but an orbital payload to go with it. Unlike the smooth-lined, spark-spitting Buck Rogers spaceships of the era, Knotsnik looked more like something made out of the leftovers from several dissimilar construction sets. But it worked, by some accounts. Knotsnik launched China Lake into the space race. Knots supported Explorer and other satellite projects of the era, many of which remain little known. And Knots probes, such as Tabstone and HITAB, conducted experiments in support of pure science and military applications, from exospheric ionic composition to passive missile launch detection. Knotsnik soon gave way to the more polished and sophisticated Caleb vehicle, which China Lake used to conduct and support studies and experiments with peculiar names like Hi-Ho and Dixie-Pixie, and more ominous designations like Project Cerberus. Far in advance of Star Wars and the Air Force's ASAT, China Lake had designed and begun testing an air-launched satellite killer called SIP, and the station was participating in the earliest incarnations of SDI, programs such as Defender, Skipper, and Dark Fence. During the late 1950s and early 60s, Knots designed and built portable satellite tracking stations and deployed them around the globe. The China Lake ranges also saw supersonic track testing of the Gemini capsule escape system, and later of the Space Shuttle escape system and various components of NASA probes and planetary landers. Early on, Knots applied its unparalleled propulsion expertise to the creation of the 1105R, a prototype lunar soft landing vehicle described in the press as a bowling ball perched on a bar stool. The device was successfully tested on an ersatz lunar surface with a technologically edgy autonomous landing system. By the late 60s, most of the station's satellite and space research projects had been overcome by inter-service rivalry and mission purification. China Lake did, however, and does, continue to reach for the stars, supporting satellite-linked tactical systems, propulsion requirements, and a variety of exotic components and subsystems for new generations of far-flung explorers. But that's another story.